Welcome to Run the Adventure, a podcast about getting the most out of your published modules for your tabletop role-playing game. I'm your host, Sid Razavi. For this, the 10th episode, I go back to the beginning with my favorite module from back in the day, the Isle of Dread. Like many gamers of a certain generation, I got introduced to RPGs with Frank Mentzer's Red Box Dungeons & Dragons. I remember rushing to my aunt's house after buying it from the local bookshop in Portsmouth. I played the solo adventure, curse you Burgle, and I couldn't wait to share it with my friends once the summer holidays were over. But waiting over the summer months, I couldn't be content just making up dungeons and populating them. As a sign of my lifelong lack of impulse control when it comes to buying RPGs, I went and bought the remaining box sets with what little savings a 10-year-old me had acquired. What propelled D&D beyond choose-your-own-adventure or fighting fantasy books was what I found in the Blue Expert set. More rules, yes, but more importantly, a new adventure, a new kind of adventure. One of the best adventures I ever found, and the beginning of a world of possibilities. Inside was contained the orange cover of X1, Isle of Dread, which gave not just a sea adventure, not just a wilderness hex crawl, but also the first rough sketch of the known world. The setting that would later be branded Mystara was my first and longest lasting love for any RPG setting. In brief paragraphs on the third page, evocative places were conjured up. Places such as the Helden Freehold, full of blonde barbarians, the Effinger Canite, of migrant horse herders, and the Kingdom of Arendi, whose palaces were carved out of white coral. Now, no longer content to spend those August days mapping dungeons on graph paper, I started making sheets of my own hex grids so I could map entirely new worlds. I pored over the Isle of Dread, borrowing ideas and, let's face it, stealing liberally to make countless iterations of my own fantasy adventures. When I finally got back to school and introduced D&D to my friends, it wasn't the classic B1 Into the Unknown or even B2 Keep of the Borderlands that we played. No, we quickly worked on a little adventure of my own invention and were sailing fast to the Isle on board a galley, quickly skipping past character levels 1 to 3 like a flat stone propelled on the water. For the next few months of school, in our lunchtime club, we occupied the English teacher's classroom playing D&D, exploring the Isle of Dread. Occasionally, we would have barbaric taunters disrupt our game as the other school kids leered in mocking curiosity at what we were doing. But when you're the hairy Middle Eastern kid in the northeast of England in the 1980s, you learn to put up or punch your way through such nonsense. The Lunchtime D&D Club was secured for the year before we switched to a less public Saturday all-day session at a friend's house. Still, if you ask me what got me through that last year of primary school, or indeed if I remember anything at all from that time, it would be the bite-sized sessions of D&D every day and thinking about the next session the rest of the time. Recently, as role-playing online has made it possible for a lot more gaming than adulthood had previously allowed, my thoughts have drifted to the old modules. Having devoted myself to running and making the most of published adventures for some silly podcast, I thought wouldn't it be good to see whether this old classic was playable? But finding time for another campaign threatened to push that idea into the long grass. Until, of course, I realized I worked with some geeks who loved to game. So, with unabashed abandon, I approached them to see if they would be interested in playing a bit of D&D old school for an hour at lunchtimes. And so it was that the Lunchtime Club was resurrected. Playing for short sessions at lunch was a bit awkward at first. Progress was slow, as you might imagine, but I think we've gotten better at maximizing the fun of it and sweeping away anything that gets in the way of having fun. They're bite-sized morsels of RPG goodness now. So this episode I'll do the usual analysis of the adventure to see where the fun is at, but I'll also talk a bit about how we managed to squeeze in a bit more gaming into the day. The following content is aimed at games masters or players who want to be games masters. So if this is a module you are going to play, this is the point when it's customary to warn you about spoilers.
Summary of the adventure.
After returning from some other adventure where the player characters have discovered a cache of vellum parchment, which would make for good materials for scroll writing, the party gets caught in some kind of torrential rain. When the parchment dries out, they find some secret writing revealed upon it. It is a ship's log and the beginnings of a map of an island far to the south of Karamakos that no one has heard about. It recounts how the crew encountered a village of islanders who spoke of an ancient city deep into the large island. In this city is a fabled great black pearl of the gods. The village exhibited metalwork and statues that were beyond the skills of its current inhabitants. This made the captain of the ship think there may be something to their old legends. Skirting around the island to produce the map of the coast, the captain then set sail to return to Specularum, the capital of Karamakos. Now, whatever happened to him afterwards, if he ever made it back to the island, we don't know. Only the secret writing attests to his discovery. With the log and the map, the players have all the motivation an old-school module would expect you need to get going. Preparation for the sea voyage, the acquisition of a suitable vessel and crew are left open to players to devise with a few ideas for dungeon masters to assist. The voyage to the island may be filled with storms and other perils, but assuming the ship is not sunk, they will reach the village of Tanora on the coast. There they will meet representatives of the 4 clans of the indigenous folk: the Elk clan, the Hawk clan, the Tiger clan, and the Sea Turtle clan. They find out that Tanora is one of 7 villages run by the matriarchs of the clans. What makes Tanora particularly interesting is that it alone amongst the villages has a great wall and iron-reinforced gates, plus a great pyramid atop its central hill. The villages all lend warriors to defend Tanora, which holds a sacred position amongst the 7 villages and is the seat of the Zombie Master, the head of the cult of the Walking Dead. Once the party has made landfall and hopefully established cordial relations with the natives, so their basic needs can be met, it is time to explore the island. Outside the central plateau, there are a diverse range of possible adventuring sites on the map provided. From the lairs of sea creatures through rock baboons to stranger primate-looking creatures called phanatons. My personal favorite is the Arania, the magic-using intelligent spiders. There are also dinosaurs, dragons, and troglodytes to encounter. Overall, exploring the island is a great hex crawl through the wilderness with the possibility of many fantastic adventures along the way. The final part of the adventure concerns the central plateau and the fabled city contained within it. Past the Treant forest and the fantastic gold mines, there lies at the center of the plateau a great lake. On its shore, the village of Mantru offers the party a chance to meet more of the indigenous folks. They will be told to stay away from Taboo Island at the center of the lake, where a temple is located. Tribal guardsmen armed with relics of the lost kingdom of Copra guard the entrance. Beyond them, a 3-level dungeon crawl awaits that promises treasures and ancient secrets. At the end of this, the player characters that have survived will have amassed many magical items and the experience for further adventures. Amongst the many treasures they may have discovered is the incredible Black Pearl.
Adventure structure.
The module is divided into 5 parts. The first part gives a short overview of the module and provides the first glimpse of the known world setting, with a map of the continent and some brief paragraphs on each of the nations. There is a little about the weather and the climate, which verges from cold northern reaches to tropical southern islands with a large temperate zone in the middle. Pretty much what you would expect from a setting with a close parity with real-world medieval Europe, with a few elements borrowed from the Middle East and Asia. The second part concerns the preparations and travel to the Isle of Dread, with advice on using the various wilderness monster tables provided. It also provides a keyed map of the island with about 24 encounter locations. This includes the village of Tenora, the lairs of various sea creatures, the camp of some Rakasta, cat-like humanoids, pirates, Thanaton, those halfling-sized monkey raccoons, Arania, intelligent spiders, rocks, hippogriffs, dinosaurs of various kinds, ogres, and both a green dragon and a sea hydra. Oh, and don't forget the wretched troglodytes. Basically, every expert level D&D monster you could hope to meet is here somewhere on the island. The third part of the module covers the central plateau with the Treant Forest, lake, and the village of Mantru. In comparison to the others, this is a bit brief. It's an interlude before the final part of the adventure that takes place on Taboo Island. Taboo Island and the temple contained is the subject of the fourth part. This sees the party fighting the villagers on their quest to loot the temple or deal with the zombie master. There are a fair few hazards inside the temple, from piranhas to fire traps. The main challenge is the Kopru, the amphibious humanoids who dwell in the mud and wield powerful charm magics. The final part of the module concerns the various monsters and NPCs introduced, providing various stat blocks and some pretty helpful descriptions for the Dungeon Master to work with.
Where the fun is at.
It should be noted here, there are actually two historical versions of this module. The original module released in 1980 with a bluish cover, and the 1983 version with the orange cover, which was included in the Blue Expert set I remember. Thanks to Goodman Games' Original Adventures Reincarnated series of glorious hardback reprintings, it is possible to compare and contrast both, as well as peruse a lot of additional content, including interviews with Zeb Cook, who wrote it. It also includes a refreshed version of the adventure for the 5th edition game. There was also a version of the adventure in Dungeon Magazine 114 for 3rd edition back in 2004 with a more fleshed out adventure hook called Torrents of Dread. Otherwise, that version remained fairly faithful to the 1983 version, with some of the rough edges softened. Comparing the 1980 to the 1983 versions only, the structure is pretty much the same, although the 1983 version improves greatly on the quality of the descriptions, maps, and handouts for players. By comparison, the 1980 version leaves the DM to fill in a lot of the descriptive work and put it all together in an evocative way. I must admit, if I had first encountered that version of the Isle of Dread, I doubt I would have been quite as smitten. The art reminds me of those 1980s comics which modeled their stories on Robert Louis Stevenson style adventures. It also has a lot of that Indiana Jones vibe that you might expect with native tribesmen and ancient temples and big snakes. The creatures and monsters you meet are all just wonderful. Rakasta riding saber-toothed tigers, dinosaurs, spellcasting spiders, gargoyles up on the cliffs, ogres in caves, dinosaurs, and oh, those wretched troglodytes. You're never told why they are so wretched. Maybe all troglodytes are wretched, I don't know. Maybe these are especially so. The module packs a lot in, and it's all waiting for a party of adventurers to discover. As you read it, you can imagine the kind of crazy fun that might happen. And some of it did happen for us. Fighting a dinosaur, running away from the sea hydra, dealing with the Rakasta, having their prized treasure stolen by raiding gargoyles, climbing the peaks to have to fight the hippogriff in its lair, rescuing one of the tribespeople from the ogre's cave. All kinds of adventure can be played out. Replayability does not even cover it. With the hex scroll being what it is, your players are more likely to reach the plateau and finish the adventure than they are to explore every inch of the island.
What doesn't work?
For modern sensibilities, this is a module with a couple of problems that is worth addressing. First, let me deal with the main structural problem, and then address a somewhat sensitive content issue. Structurally, the module does not provide you with very many answers about how things are meant to work. It begins with the assumption that your players will find some scrolls and head out to sea to find this island and seek out the Black Pearl. Okay, that isn't really a problem if you engage with the spirit of the adventure genre. But it is notable that in both the 3rd edition and 5th edition refreshes, the writers tasked with bringing the modules to modern players felt the need to give more hooks and motivation for the party to make the voyage. Frankly, I don't know if that is worth the effort. Look, if you're expecting a game of nuanced, character-driven drama, then you're going to be sorely disappointed. If you want to recreate the spirit of one of those old paperback adventure books, where some explorer just go to some island where dinosaurs and spellcasting spiders live a few miles apart for no good reason, then you will enjoy this adventure. Call me a brute of a DM, but the motivation for players is that the DM got this cool adventure and wants to run it, so bring over the crisps and fizzy drink and roll up some characters, goddammit. A lot of characters, because quite a few of them are gonna die. But I'll admit, this is a bit of a sensibility issue, and my nostalgia may be getting the better of my judgment here. I had just turned into a teenager when I first played this, and I didn't need a complex backstory to make this work. Why are we going to the island? Because it will be cool. Why are there so many different creatures on the island? It's magic! Shut up and roll some dice. There's a lot of things that are common currency today with the placement of inhabitants of an adventure site meant to make sense and have lives when the PCs aren't there that simply doesn't hold up here. Sure, you can give the villagers a life of their own and maybe weave stories of how the various creatures interact, but like the land that time forgot, the module writers don't give you any of that. Everything is waiting for the PCs to show up and mess with what must have been equilibrium for a very long time. Look, if your players are the sort to meet a dinosaur and go, yeah, I'm not really feeling this, I'm not seeing the value of pressing further into the jungle, why are we here, what's my motivation, then you're going to have to just find some goddamn new players. Better players. Players with a sense of wonder and imagination, who are not jaded by decades of consumer subsistence labor and lifelong debt to finally own some bricks before they die, only to look back and wonder, why didn't I spend more time playing games about riding saber-toothed tigers on a lance charge at a freaking dinosaur? So, whilst I normally suggest you add depth and wonder to an adventure to tailor it to your particular group, be careful that in your efforts to modernize this, you don't lose the sense of wonder and adventure that an island full of every damn thing the expert set bestiary can throw at players can provide. However, I will now get to the problem of tone. Most of these adventures from the 1980s are written by a certain narrow cohort of role players who formed the hobby. They saw things from a certain cultural vantage. They grew up on these adventure stories where smart, daring, white Europeans went to backward, savage islands full of black and brown people who did voodoo and other horrible things. The white Europeans, Karamakons, were the heroes, and the natives were either to be pitied or feared and killed. Or, in the suggestion of one bit of the module, enslaved. That's the kind of stories they grew up on. They didn't mean any harm in trying to recreate those same stories in their role-playing adventures. They are rarely intentionally offensive. It's just the way they thought about Black Islands and faraway lands. That's just the stories they grew up on as kids. Colonialism and Orientalism was ingrained for the most part. So the last thing I want to do is alienate what is likely to be a portion of my audience. I grew up on the same stories. Of course, when I ran Isle of Dread for my friends as a kid, I drew on the same stereotypes and caricatures. I portrayed the various tribal people in exactly the way I had seen from the films and books I'd read. Sure, I was the Middle Eastern kid with the funny name, but all my friends, everyone who ever played D&D with me, was white English or American. I never experienced what running that kind of content would be like for someone who felt any affinity with the people who are being othered in these stories. I had to wait for the influx of books and films about Middle Eastern terrorists to feel that for myself. Hey, I was a kid, and these were exciting stories. We didn't mean any harm. I'm sure the writers of the module didn't mean any harm either. I wondered when I read the interviews with Zeb Cook or any of the other articles in the Goodman Games edition whether this would be broached, but no, they just don't see it yet. I'm sure all those reviews of old school stuff like this who skip past all these racial stereotype tropes don't mean any harm either. I suspect it's just that their worldview doesn't even notice these things. They don't identify with anyone but the Karamakons going to the island, not with the islanders. But I'm not a kid anymore, and I think the hobby as a whole is more inclusive than it was in the 1980s and 90s. You can trace some of this evolution even in the early revision in 1983 reprint, which gets rid of the most severe racial imagery, and some of the most problematic stuff is no longer present in the 2004 version in Dungeon Magazine. One welcome change in these later editions is it avoids suggesting that enslaving the natives is a viable way of going about things, especially if you want that gold. The Goodman Games update for 5e seems to lack this sensitivity and may in some ways be a bit regressive. Like many older gamers and writers looking back at the old stuff, I like to capture what was good about those old games. But I'm not looking to turn back the clock on how we treat people different to us. To deny that these are really sensitive topics and merit consideration of how proxies for Black Caribbeans are portrayed in an RPG module, for example. I can almost hear the cries to keep wokery out of RPG games. But let's say you're not just playing with the same old dudes who look like you and want to welcome people who might be a bit different to you at your table. In that case, I think it's worth considering how you treat the indigenous people here in this module, whether you want to make some changes to it, because what you have is a rip-roaring adventure with just a slightly outdated view of the world. And if you choose not to change it, that's for you and your gaming group to decide. I'm certainly not going to say you're a bad person. We're all just doing the best we can, right? We probably wouldn't want to play at each other's table anyway. However, for me, a modest change in presentation and a little reconsideration of the finale of the module could make for a better adventure in any case.
Make it your own.
I think the module is more of a toolkit than a story waiting to be told. As such, what tools from the kit you wish to deploy, or what others you decide to add, is really up to you. It might be said that this is not a module that is ready to play without a fair bit of DM work, but it really depends on how happy you are at improvising. It can work pretty well with just some random tables and a lot of winging it. Before modifying it further, I think that's a good idea to establish what the rules of the game are. What level of realism do you want here? Do you want to try to make sense of why there are all these creatures on the island? Do you want to make the island have a life without the players? Do you want a meta plot or a narrative in place that the players have to discover? If the answer to any of these is yes, then you will need to make some notes about the factions, by which I include any cluster of intelligent creatures that claims a bit of territory on the island, and how they interact with each other. Relationship maps are a decent way of modeling this, although I simply made 3-point list with some of the key relations I wanted to introduce. For example, the ogres had kidnapped some of the tribe. The Rakasta were after the Black Pearl themselves and also had a problem with a dinosaur that was threatening their camp. The pirates were looking for a way off the island and would do a deal with the party, or better yet, steal their boat if they could find it. Things like that can give you some notes to weave possible interactions and give players more meaningful jobs that make sense of their exploration of the island. It's also essential to keep both the location and relations between these factions updated as the players change the landscape. After a session, it might pay to think what the death of some monster would mean to the nearby factions. Would they move into the area? Would this start a new conflict between two groups which were previously divided by the lair of a dragon, for example? With the ogre dead, do the lizard folk feel emboldened to raid further inland? All these kinds of questions might lead to interesting developments to play out in future sessions. There is a school of thought of world design that might carefully lay out a map like this with what makes sense because of the history of the world. But this is not what the Isle of Dread offers. However, what it does offer is a vat to grow a crazy new history out of the events that occur. What happens when two tribes that have been kept at peace due to the nearby presence of spell-weaving spiders no longer have them to worry about? What if the spiders ally themselves, thanks to the players, with the tribes? I think a lot of fun can be had working out the simulations that arise from this. But a word of caution, that this may not be what your players are primarily interested in. I know my teenage friends were never interested in that stuff, and I'm not sure my grown-up adult players have as much interest in those things as I do. Exploration and combat are what they want from their lunchtime games. Role-playing, and particularly political role-playing, is much further down the list. As the GM, I have to do a lot of self-restraining of my writer self who wants to explore these aspects of the world. Instead, the mantra is to focus only on what the player characters want to do.
How it played.
For the past few months, I've been running a semi-regular lunchtime game of old school essentials with a few work colleagues. We've managed to get about 3 one-hour sessions in a week as we work through the Isle of Dread. 1-hour sessions require getting down to business very quickly. They also need a lot of hand-waving away long sequences of combat. I've adopted a fairly simplified form of the rules that I found useful for these quick sessions, as well as when playing with my young kids. It boils down to 3 simple mechanics. 1. To hit something, you roll a d20, and if the number rolled equals to or is greater than the creature's armor class, you've scored a hit. Sometimes you will need to save against one of your attributes. You roll a d20, and if you get the same or lower as your attribute, you pass the test. Saves are a broad category of things, including just trying to do something like climb, smashing open a door, avoid hurting yourself from a fall, seeing through an illusion, or convincing an NPC to give you something. Third and finally, for every kind of skilled activity such as investigation, or checking for traps, or listening at a door, or picking locks, you roll a d6, and if you get a 1 you succeed, unless you're a dwarf, elf, halfling, or thief, in which case you succeed on a 1 or a 2. Character class options and spells complicate matters a little bit, but not by much. I don't add any new mechanics, just fit whatever it is into one of the 3 mechanics on offer: d20 hit rolls, d20 saves, and d6 checks. Some might think 3 is quite a lot actually, and I know there are simpler systems out there, but it works for my retroclone purposes. To speed up combat, I tend to play fast and loose with the monster's hit points. I ignore that entirely. I divide most creatures into a number of hits they can take from the PCs. Either 1 hit, 2 hits, half the number of PCs present, or very rarely equal to the number of PCs present. Most things are defeated on 1 hit. Tough lieutenants take a couple of hits. Beasts might take 4, and things like dinosaurs 8, which is the recommended party size. These old-school adventures expect a lot more players than most modern games can cope with, so I have players run 2 PCs at a time. For more traditional playthroughs, retainers and so on come into play, but everybody in my lunchtime game is running 2 4th-level characters using these simplified rules, with a retinue of unnamed crew ready to resupply dead PCs as we go. In most sessions, the party travels just about 1 or 2 hexes on the map. I try to make every hex have something, although rarely monsters. There's always something to discover, some descriptive element with which they can interact with. Food, water, and shelter are often highly prized finds. More mysterious and strange things occasionally pop up. I started by just winging these things, but recently started making lists of ideas that I can draw on depending on what piques my interest and the mood of my players. You can always count the rows and make a roll if you want randomness. The important thing is, when the meat of your session is about 45 minutes long after you've all settled in, you want to be getting the players engaged as soon as possible. You want to put a decision to them without delay. Do they poke or ignore? Do they fight or flee? Do they talk or hide? Make them roll some dice. That's fun. And remember to mix wonder into everything from the mundane to the magical. When your players are in the middle of a workday, any spark of imagination is welcome.
And finally,
The Isle of Dread still gives me that wonderment and excitement of being a young lad discovering D&D for the first time. It's pure imagination fuel. Taken for what it is, with some modest adjustments for a broader fellowship of players, it is great fun. The trick to running it again for me has been to pare back the rules to the bare essentials, to make things fast and furious, to make every few minutes sparkle with discovery and danger. It's true, at different times I want more grit, more dread, more character drama than it can offer. But 30 years on, I still can't help but smile when my players encounter the Rakasta riding saber-toothed tigers or fight a dinosaur. This may in fact be all the evidence needed to convict me of not having fully grown up. But if that's the court's judgment, so be it. Stuff your dull beige wooden panels, I'm off to the Isle of Dread. Thank you for listening to Run the Adventure with me, your host, Sid Razavi. I'd love to hear any feedback, questions, or your thoughts on this episode, or indeed the entire run so far. I'm really grateful for the comments and feedback I've received so far. I'd also like to give special thanks to my guests and Patreons. If you'd like to support the show, you can find details in the show notes. You can also reach me on email gm@runtheadventure.com or find me on Twitter at RTA_podcast. If you liked what you've heard so far, please consider leaving a positive review on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcast, or wherever you found this pod. Even better, please share the pod with your friends and on social media. Links to today's adventures are available on the show notes and on the website. That's www.runtheadventure.com. Until the next episode, may your adventure run fantastic.